The gas station lights flickered as rain hammered the pavement. A police cruiser screeched to a stop, its sirens slicing through the night. Hands where I can see them. An officer barked, gun trembling in his grip. The man froze, a calm shadow beneath the storm, his eyes steady, unafraid. They cuffed him without a word, dragging him into the flashing blue haze. By morning, he'd be sitting on the judge's bench, deciding their fate. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. Night had a way of settling into the empty places of the city like a slow, deliberate hand. The gas station at the corner of Meridian and Fifth stood under a pool of sodium light that yellowed everything it touched: the pumps, the litter, the faded sticker on the glass that promised open 24 hours. Rain had passed through earlier, leaving the air washed and sharp, carrying the smell of hot asphalt and wet cardboard. A stray radio inside the mini-mart hummed low, playing something tinny and old that fit the tired mood of the block. Michael Carter liked this hour. There were fewer people to perform for, fewer eyes to judge the quiet of his life. He liked the anonymity the night offered, the way it let him move through the city without the weight of expectation. He worked nights now, doing odd jobs, delivering packages, fixing things other people threw away. It was not the career he had planned when he was young and spoke in classrooms about justice and order. But it kept the lights on, and for Michael that had to be enough for now. Tonight, he stood with one hand on the cold pump and his other rubbing the sore place above his rib, where a bruise had been forming for days. He was tall in a way that made him look like he belonged in two rooms at once: the proud, upright room he had imagined as a boy and the narrower, quieter room he actually inhabited. Michael's skin drank the orange light, and there was a gap in his grin where a tooth had been chipped years ago, the result of a thrown baseball and a foolish bet. His coat was too thin for the season. He would remedy that someday, he told himself, because promises are cheap and hope costs more than it seems. He had been a clerk at the courthouse 10 years ago, a job that fed his early yearning to be part of the law. He had read transcripts under bad fluorescent lights and listened to men and women cross themselves before swearing. Later, he studied, long after his rent was paid and after midnight, and passed a bar exam that refused to be simple. He hadn't taken the quick road. He knew the rules by heart and learned to read people the way his grandmother read church hymns. Slow, with tears and a sense that something holy might be hiding in plain sight. Yet the city does not always reward what we deserve. Michael had been passed over time and again for promotions that went to quieter men who nodded more readily in the right rooms. He learned to keep his face neutral in those moments, and his disappointment folded itself into a patient kind of rage that he carried like a spare coat. He had learned how to let the world think less of him and to keep moving anyway. At the pump, his phone buzzed. A message from a woman named Sarah, soft, practical words that had become the ballast of his week. She was a public defender who worked too hard and loved without permission. "Call when you can," she wrote. Michael thumbed a reply that said soon, though his schedule rarely allowed for the leisure of long conversations. He was, after all, running between a dozen futures. The station's fluorescent sign flickered, and a truck slid into the next pump with a grumble. Two patrol cars idled across the street like sentries, their drivers half visible beneath the glow of dashboard lights. Michael watched them without thinking, an old reflex from the courthouse days, watching the watchers, cataloging their faces like exhibits. When he saw the officers step out, jackets creaking, he did not move. His hands were in his pockets. He looked ordinary. He hoped being ordinary would be a shield. One of the officers, short, broad-shouldered, with a jaw like a hinge, crossed the street. He came with the briskness of someone who was used to deciding when a conversation was over. Michael recognized him from a week before, when a claim had been made about a late-night altercation near the bus stop. The officer had been part of the response team, calm and efficient in front of the cameras. Up close, his badge printed the city in small letters and a name that Michael would come to know: Thomas Reed. "Evening, sir," Thomas said. He did not smile. He moved with the plain authority of someone who believed the world was a series of boxes labeled with rules. "You live around here?" Michael smelled the faint trace of coffee at Thomas's collar. He answered with the same, even tone he kept for depositions and late invoices. "I do," he said, "just filling up." The other officer, a woman named Rebecca, watched from the hood of their cruiser. She had eyes that missed nothing, and they fixed on Michael like a lantern. There was a small tremor in the way the air bent around her. Maybe she had had a long day, too. Maybe they all had. "Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Thomas asked. His voice had that legal softness that can cut like glass. Michael kept his hands visible, palms turned to show he had nothing to hide. "Sure," he said. He felt the old nervousness that once visited him before oral exams and important hearings, 6 breaths deep, then even out. The night was a witness. They asked for ID. Michael produced his wallet. They asked if he had any weapons. He laughed, the sound low and surprised. He had not expected the question. "No," he said. He repeated it as if to make it real. Then they asked about a small bundle of cash Michael had hidden away for a newer suit he could afford one day. It lay in his back pocket, like a secret. The question was specific, pointed, as if it had been waiting in the cuff of Thomas's sleeve. The officers spoke of a report. Someone had called in suspicious activity. A man who fit Michael's general description was said to be tampering with a pump. The rhythm of the accusation was mechanical. The city loved simple narratives, nothing complicated if it could be reduced to a checklist. Michael's pulse leaned into his throat, but he kept his voice level. He explained that he had only been filling his tank. He told them about being up late, stocking shelves, about plans to catch a bus north at dawn. He mentioned Sarah, because names anchor stories in truth. The officers exchanged looks, brief, like annotated margins. Rebecca asked the same questions a second time, as if repetition could extract the truth the first time had hidden. Then something small moved the air. A man stumbling out of the mini-mart, smelling of cheap cologne and raw regret. He backed into the pump where Michael stood and squinted, looking for tolerance he had long since run out of. He mumbled something about a missing receipt and muttered the color of Michael's jacket, as if that solved everything. The man's presence bent the moment into a different shape. The caller's memory was, suddenly, a competing testimony. Thomas's hand went to his hip in emotion, so practiced it belonged to a different, older world. "Sir, step away from the pump." It was not an order dressed as a question. Michael stepped back. He did not run. He had learned where running ended in the wrong rooms. He had also learned that compliance can sometimes be a thin shield. The cuff clicked like the close of a book. A neighbor watching from an upstairs window would later describe the moment as quiet, inevitable. Michael's plea that there must be a mistake slid through the small openings of Thomas's patience. "You can tell that at the station," Thomas said, folding the city into syllables. As they led Michael to the cruiser, he felt the night recalibrating itself around him. The officer's flashlight sliced across his features, flattening the dignity he had carried like armor. Rebecca's eyes found him with something unreadable, then looked away. The radio whispered static, a rumor of other nights. Sarah's message blinked unanswered on Michael's phone in his back pocket, its soft light a small, private accusation. He thought of his mother's voice, steady, like the clasp of a hand. She had told him, once, that dignity is something you hold onto even when the world tries to take your name. Michael tried to hold on now, tongue thin between teeth, and let the city bear witness. Inside the patrol car, the world reduced to a space of vinyl and glass, he watched the station recede and the street lamp pools blur into streaks. His hands were still cuffed, but his thoughts were not. He catalogued, as if reciting a list to keep himself from being swallowed. The names of cases he had read, the faces of judges who had listened and moved on, the rusted hinge of the courthouse door that had always seemed like a promise. At the edge of his inventory of truths, a single worry glowed. The bruise above his rib, the one he had been ignoring. It might be nothing, he told himself. It might be the echo of a bad fall earlier in the week. But in the city, Little things gathered meaning like rain gathers in gutters, and Michael had learned to watch them when others did not. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the sound of the cruiser's engine become a drumbeat. The night had given him a simple lesson that moments of injustice often arrive without fanfare, dressed in ordinary clothing. His story, he thought, would not be simple. It would, if he had learned anything, require patience, clarity, and a stubborn insistence on truth. He did not know, then, that the next day would bring a turn so strange it would make the city look twice at its own reflection. He only knew the immediate weight of cuffs and the smaller, steadier weight of a name that still belonged to him. The cell smelled like old breath and stale coffee when they let Michael go before dawn. The world outside had that pale, brittle light that comes after sleepless nights, nothing like the warm orange of the street lamps he liked. He walked home with his jacket zipped to his chin, the cuff still warm from the handcuffs that had been removed at the station. His ribs ached where the bruise rested, a quiet pulse of pain that reminded him of the narrowness of the previous hours. He did not know yet that the day would not move in ordinary lines. He thought at first of small things, a bowl to warm, a pot to wash, Sarah's message still waiting in his phone. He pictured the courthouse steps and the rusted hinge of its heavy door, a familiar promise. He rehearsed phrases he might say if asked, the carefully measured words of someone who knew what law could do when language was clear and witnesses were steady. At his building, an envelope sat wedged in the stairwell like an afterthought. No stamp, no return. The hand that had pushed it there had left it with the casual violence of someone who wanted something put where it would be found. Michael felt the cold paper at the base of his fingers and the small bolt of alarm that came with any unexpected thing. Inside, instead of a letter, there was a small plastic case, one of those cheap thumb drives, and a single line scrawled on a scrap of paper. Watch. No cops. It was not a threat. It read like a dare. He did not plug the drive into his phone. He had learned to be careful with things that arrive without names. But his hands trembled anyway when he put the drive into his pocket. The tremor was not wholly feared. It was a strange mixture of curiosity and a thought that would not go away. Someone had seen something and decided it mattered enough to risk showing him. He thought of Rebecca's eyes at the gas station, the way she had found his gaze, and then looked away. He thought of Thomas's hinged jaw, the practiced motions, the light that had flattened him at the pump. The city had a way of telling stories in fragments. The drive might be one of those fragments that folded into a larger sentence. At home, he poured coffee and sat at the small table that had seen better mornings. He did not have a computer with much power, only an old laptop he used for legal research and notes when he could steal time. The drive slid into the USB slot with a small click that sounded louder than it should in the quiet kitchen. Files opened. A single video file waited like a held breath. The footage was from the gas station's camera, the kind that records in grainy squares and ignores faces that do not matter to whoever owns the feed. For the first minute, nothing happened. Rain-slick pavement, a slow spill of customers, the fluorescent sign in its steady flicker. Then Michael stepped into the frame. He saw himself as a bystander sees a stranger on a screen, smaller in movement, more uncertain. The officers came into view. Then Thomas, the strict set of his shoulders, the patient tone of a man who has been taught the world is organized into right and wrong. Then the camera captured something else. It showed Thomas bending toward the pump, his hand on a small object at his belt. It showed Rebecca glancing just a flick and then looking elsewhere. The angle made it hard to see the clear detail of the motion, but it showed Thomas reach and press something small and dark into Michael's jacket pocket. The motion was quick, a calculated flick of fingers. A pump sensor beeped an ordinary sound, and the world kept turning. Michael watched himself reach for his wallet in the footage, and then, later, be told about a report. The grainy black and white made no promises about charity or mercy. In the corner of the frame, an older man leaned near the shop door, his face a blur. His mouth moved like someone recalling a script. The camera caught less of his intent, and more of the way events rearranged themselves to suit a story someone had already decided to tell. He rewound. He watched the moment again. The more he watched, the more the small movements sat like seeds, waiting to grow into consequence. It was impossible, he told himself in the rational voice he had taught himself in depositions. Nothing in that footage was absolute proof. The camera's angle could fool, the lighting could hide, yet the image lodged in his chest like a splinter. Why had someone put the drive in the stairwell for him? Why not go to the press, to the watchful eyes of a woman like Sarah who loved the law enough to fight for it? Who would risk this, risk a retaliation that sometimes came like a quiet footstep? He called Sarah. She picked up on the second ring, her voice raw with tired kindness. "Michael," she said. Under the word was worry. He did not tell her about the drive at first. He spoke the small truths that tethered them, where he had been, how they had cuffed him, what the officers had said. She promised to be there if he needed her. He wanted to tell her everything and could not. The drive sat heavy in his pocket, a secret that had the look of an accusation. When he told her finally, she asked questions like a surgeon, careful, precise. "Do you want to see it?" she asked. He hesitated. Telling Sarah would be the same as opening a window into his life. It would make things public, real. He wanted, somehow, to know who had left the drive. That need to know burned like the bruise above his ribs. Sarah did not press. She said, "Bring it to me. Don't post. Don't show. We'll look at it together." Her voice steadied him. It anchored him to the notion that the law could be a shelter, not just a set of rules. That afternoon, someone else saw the video. It spread like a spill. A neighbor uploaded a shaky copy to a community group from a phone he kept like a second conscience. The clip found its way to a local reporter, then to a morning show that lived on scandal and quick judgments. The city smelled the potential of outrage and began to breathe in its shape. With the spread came voices. Some yelled about misconduct, about what it meant when those who promised order seemed to move outside of it. Others spoke of the danger of accusations and the damage they do when cast without context. Michael watched the commentary like one watches a storm approach, distant thunder, a brightening sky. He felt his name being shaped into opinions he had not been invited to witness. And then, beneath the noise, a quieter thing arrived. A typed letter slid under his door that evening. No signature, no return, only 2 sentences, bold and deliberate. "Beware the ones who save faces for favor. They know the shape of leverage." The handwriting was careful, the ink steady. The note could have been a warning. It could have been a threat. It could have been the thin voice of someone who saw the world and wanted to make sure Michael would choose well. He did not know. What he felt more than anything was that the moments had tilted. The city's quiet had broken into shards, and each shard held a different truth. At night, he held the drive in his hand and turned it over as if it were a coin that might tell fortune. He thought of Rebecca looking away, of Thomas's practice motion, of Sarah's calm voice. He thought of the bruise, of the way the gas station light had flattened him, making him shareable in a way he had not been before. The ordinary life he had lived, the small jobs, the late study, the careful plans, felt suddenly like a stage waiting for a scene he had not written. He knew then that the day had given him a choice. He could let the city make a story out of him, let the pieces fall where they would, assigned like parts without rehearsal. Or he could act. The idea of acting felt dangerous and also strangely like breath. Some betrayals are loud, announced with a brass trumpet. Others are quiet, a hand at the pocket when you are not looking. The footage in the cheap plastic box suggested the latter. It suggested motives moving like shadows behind men who wore badges. Michael slid his fingers into his pocket and closed them on the drive. In that small clasp was a redirection of fate. He did not yet know who would betray whom, but he felt the shape. The next morning would begin the race toward answers, and the race would not be fair. Night and morning braided themselves together in Michael's thoughts, and the city kept turning while he tried to catch up. He met Sarah in the courthouse hallway, where the light always smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. She stood with a stack of files hugged to her chest like armor. Her hair was pulled back, and there was a tired softness around her mouth that came from too many hours spent arguing for people who had no one else to argue for. "You looked small on that video," she said without preamble when she saw him. Her voice had the blunt kindness of someone who did not want to waste time on pleasantries. She reached for his hand, a quick squeeze that gave both comfort and news. She was present, she was paying attention. Michael let the squeeze anchor him. "I watched it again," he said. "Hi, I want to know who left the drive." Sarah's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with the work of someone cataloging possibilities. Someone wanted you to see it. That means help, or it means someone wants you to act. Both are dangerous. She paused as if weighing a verdict. "We will be careful." She said we. The small word folded them together. It made him think of days when justice felt like a straight line, one that bent now into questions. Sarah had a faith in the law that sometimes made her blind to its limits. Michael admired that stubborn belief. He also feared it. The law, he had learned, is human, and humans carry their own needs into courtrooms. Rebecca's silence after the arrest had a voice of its own. Michael watched her from across the room at his first hearing, seated where the public sits. Her uniform did not hide the way she held herself, careful, alert, with a curl of thought always at the edge of her face. When their eyes met, she lifted a brow once and then looked away. Was that a pity, distance, or something else? He could not tell, and the not knowing burned like hunger. Thomas Reed was another kind of weather. In the courtroom, he wore a suit that pulled at the seams of his morning briskness. He moved through people like someone who expected them to clear the way. Michael had seen that kind of man before, the sort who measures everything in risk and calibration. He watched Thomas sitting with the detectives as if he were cataloging odds. Michael wanted, at times, to believe Thomas was only doing his job, but the clip on the drive had lodged an image of a hand and a motion behind his ribs. There was also Grace, Michael's sister, who called him on the second day and used the long sing-song voice of someone trying to spin calm from a spool. "You'll be okay," she said. "You always are." Michael wanted to tell her how fragile okay felt now, how the bruise under his arm pulsed not only with pain, but with the memory of being made into a story. He let her lie to herself. Grace's lies were soft and meant to protect, and sometimes shelter was all one had. Conversations with Sarah changed. They were no longer just legal talk. Late at night, when the courthouse closed and the city made less noise, Sarah would sit on Michael's cracked sofa and tell him things she rarely said to clients. "I left once," she confessed one evening, the streetlight cutting stripes across her face. "I left a job in a prosecutor's office. I thought I would make a difference from the other side. I found the same machines, different faces." She told him this with the bluntness of someone who had looked into a machine and found rust. "I'll fight with you," she said, "but there are people who like things to stay the same." Michael listened, feeling the story of Sarah's life fold into his. Her truth made her more human, and her human edges made betrayal more possible. Trust was not automatic. It was built in the small acts, bringing coffee, staying late to go over footage, keeping a promise to call back. He cataloged each small kindness because he feared being surprised by someone he had let in. Rebecca's presence hovered. She came to Michael's neighborhood sometimes under the guise of routine checks, an officer being neighborly, the public relations script, the kind of visit that made people say, "See, they care." She brought details, a willingness to listen that felt like a rope thrown across a river. She once told him offhand, "You were cooperative." It was not an apology. It was a fact. Her eyes, though, suggested she wanted to say more. One night, after an exchange when Rebecca lingered in the doorway, Michael asked, "Why me?" She hesitated as if the question was a stone she had been careful not to stir. "You were there," she said finally. "You fit the report. Someone called it in." Her voice dropped a fraction. "But I don't think he planted anything." She named Thomas with a slow care, as if she were not sure where her loyalty lay. "I don't know where the drive came from." The breath left Michael then. He wanted to press. He wanted to ask if she had seen the motion on the camera, if she had ever wished to be more. Instead, he listened to her make small admissions, ones that made him warm and cold at once. Rebecca confessed, without saying it was a confession, that being part of a system sometimes made you look the other way, that she had friends inside who bent rules, the kind you call favors. Not for profit, she said, but for convenience. Her voice did not carry judgment. It carried the heavy weight of someone who had seen the compromise of small things. Those small things stacked up like turning points. Michael's memory of the night at the station changed when he remembered Rebecca's fingers hovering near her radio, the look that flicked across her face when Thomas bent to the pump. He thought of hands, of the way fingers can move an object from one pocket to another, and how a pocket is a private map of ownership. Tension lived in the spaces between words. Sarah's steady faith in law sometimes collided with Michael's quieter, more personal hunger for truth. Justice without witnesses is a rumor, he told her, frustrated once, after they had watched the footage for the third time. She answered softly, "Sometimes the law helps us make a rumor into fact, but we need the courage to stand in court and say what we saw." Courage. Michael repeated the word in his head. He thought of Grace's soft assurances and of Rebecca's hard edges. He thought of Thomas and the neat, little movements that made a man appear guilty or innocent by the push of a finger. The more he learned about the people around him, the more the lines blurred. Friends had rooms in which secrets lived, and enemies sometimes wore masks called necessity. Beneath all of it, a quieter knot of fear had started to grow in Michael's chest. It was not for himself, so much as for Sarah and Rebecca, the women who had chosen different parts of the same system. He realized that they, like him, were exposed. The drive had lit a lantern under the whole group. Everyone could be seen now, and everyone could be judged. The moral pressure of that was not academic. It was the slow removal of privacy, the way small acts could be turned into reasons. Even Grace, who wanted to believe, said, "Be careful who you trust." And Michael almost laughed at the irony. Of course he would be careful. The choice of whom to trust was no longer private, it had weight. Each name he trusted would either be a bridge or the thing that betrayed him. At the end of the week, Michael stood on his balcony and watched the city. The street below was a river of headlights. In his pocket, the drive felt like a nail hidden in cloth. He was not naive. He had learned that people protect themselves, and that protection sometimes asks for help in the form of secrets. He also understood that secrets can be used as currency. He had allies. Sarah, who would not let the law be a stranger, Grace, whose love was a shield, even if naive, Rebecca, whose silence was complicated by conscience, and unknown to him, Thomas, who smiled easily in public and kept his hand in motion in private. They orbited him now, each carrying motives he could not fully read. And in the quiet, a question began to grow louder than any answer. Who would choose to save a face for favor, and who would choose to break a rule for truth? Michael opened the drive again, because his hands would not stop shaking. He told himself he needed to be sure. He told himself he would look for anything that might clear him. Instead, he found a file he had not noticed before, smaller, buried under the footage like a secret under a floorboard. It was an audio file, and when he played it, the voice was Sarah's, very close and raw, as if she had recorded it with the phone pressed to her chest. "Michael," the voice began, and even through the speakers it felt like a whisper meant only for him. He stopped breathing. He listened. "I shouldn't be doing this," Sarah said. There was a quiet edge to her tone he had not heard in person. It was not the lawyer's calm, he knew. This was a woman who had stayed up too many nights thinking about what she had done. "I told myself I would never use people like chess pieces, but there are things I can't fix by standing by." She named a case he only half remembered, a raid years earlier, one that had gone bad, a family whose lives had been broken when evidence was mishandled. Sarah had been younger then, she said, and hungry to win. She had made a deal with a small group of officers to secure convictions. In the tape, she did not say names at first, then she named Thomas. The cadence of her speech bent as if she were forcing herself to say it. "He helped me then," she said. "He made calls. We thought we were doing the right thing. But I saw what it cost people. I thought I could leave it, bury it, turn away. Her voice trembled. I left the prosecutor's office because of that. Michael's stomach collapsed a little. He had known Sarah had left a job she had once wanted. He had never imagined the reason. The tape sounded like a confession. Not only had she relied on Thomas before, she had been part of a bargain that traded small mercies for other people's lives. She said she had watched Thomas grow comfortable with being able to change stories to nudge pieces into place. I thought I could keep him honest, Sarah's voice said. I was wrong. The tape snapped with a wet edge of emotion. So I started collecting things. She talked about small things she had noticed later, reports changed by a hand that looked like Thomas's, officers who covered for other officers with quiet notes and polite smiles. She said she had kept copies, documents, a few photos, something she had never shown anyone. She said she had been waiting for the right way to bring it down. The drive was one of those things. And Michael, she said, and the softness turned colder, you were the easiest way in. They already saw you. I thought, if they saw what he did with their own eyes, then maybe the whole thing would collapse. No one would dare look the other way. The tape ended. Michael's mouth felt hollow. The voice he had trusted to stand in court now confessed to having used him as a tool. Sarah had not simply offered help. She had engineered his exposure. She had chosen him because he was vulnerable and seen. He had been the figurehead of a reveal she wanted. He dialed her number with fingers that did not obey. She picked up immediately as if she had been waiting for that call. Michael, she said. Her voice was thin, like someone who had cut too deep. You did this, he said, the disbelief loud enough to hurt. You put the drive in my stairwell. No, she said quickly. I didn't put it there. I didn't put it directly, but I arranged for it to reach you. Her words were the careful ones she used in court when she needed to shape a truth. I had to make sure the footage would not be dismissed. Thomas is clever. If I went to the press or the inspector, they would bury it. You going through it, public, small, caught on camera, will force a reaction. Force a reaction? Michael asked. You meant to use me. You meant to tell me the story. Sarah was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, she sounded older. She told him about nights she had lain awake thinking of the family from the bad raid, of a boy who had stopped coming to court because he could not bear the looks. Sarah's words were grief dressed as strategy. I thought it was the only way, she said. I thought if I could wake up the city with someone people would sympathize with, then we could finally get the officers investigated. You made sense. You were small on tape. People would see the unfairness. Michael remembered the stack of files she carried like armor. He had trusted that armor. Now, the same armor felt like a gauntlet. He heard the echo of her last line as if it were a verdict. I had to wake the city. The betrayal was not simple. Sarah had not claimed she had plotted to ruin his life. She said she had not expected him to be humiliated the way he had been, cuffed and paraded. She said she had not expected the video to spread so fast or for the radio gossip to turn private pain into spectacle before she could build the case. She spoke of moral algebra, weighing one life of quiet dignity against exposing a system that had taken many. You chose me, Michael said. You chose to make me the instrument. I chose a way to make them listen, she said. I told myself the end would justify the means. Her words landed like a hand on his chest. Michael had always believed that law and trust should go hand in hand. He had believed Sarah more than most. Now the belief felt like an old thing he could not find in his pockets. He thought of all the nights she had sat and spoken softly of her promise to fight. If she had been planning this, to what degree had she been telling him the truth at all? Had every small kindness been part of a plan to keep him close? Anger moved into him like a tide. It was not only that she had used him, it was that she had made a moral calculation without asking him. She had decided his life could be a means to a higher justice. He could see, suddenly, how easy it is for people who believe themselves righteous to cross a line. He felt like a map someone had redrawn. Yet another feeling pressed in beneath anger, the recognition of why she had done it. He had seen the hurt in her voice. He knew her choice had been born of something real, a disgust with a system that let the powerful rewrite stories. The logic was bitterly persuasive. "You could have asked me," he said at last. "You could have brought me in." "I thought you would say no," she answered. "I thought I had to act fast. I thought if I asked, the chance would be lost." Her confession opened a new problem. If Sarah had been working to bring Thomas down, then Thomas's actions in the footage took on a different light. Maybe he had been sloppy because someone was watching him. Maybe he had been planting to provoke a reaction. Or maybe he had been cautious and someone else had forced the move. The neat line between crime and consequence became messy. Michael felt smaller and larger at the same time. Used, yes, but also suddenly part of a plan that had scope beyond him. His world shifted. He had not been the accidental victim of a routine stop. He had been chosen for a reason, placed where a city would see him. The thought made him dizzy. He had to decide what to do with that anger, with that new knowledge that the woman he trusted had chosen his life for the sake of others. He ended the call and sat in silence. Outside, headlights passed like slow thoughts. Inside, the bruise above his rib ached in time with a new kind of awareness. The first twist was not an enemy revealed with a sneer, but a friend revealed with a tremor. Sarah had betrayed him in order to expose a greater betrayal. The moral landscape shifted beneath his feet, and Michael found himself standing on new ground, one that was less certain and infinitely more dangerous. The days after Sarah's confession felt like walking on glass. Michael moved through them with the careful balance of someone who had learned that one wrong step could cut clean through a plan. The city watched in pieces, some faces sympathetic, some cruel, some hungry for drama. His inbox filled with messages, some kind and some savage. A reporter called twice. A neighbor shouted from a stoop once, asking if the video was true. Michael answered with small, careful sentences. He had learned to measure his words like weights. At work, the odd job slowed. People who used to hand him tasks found reasons to delay. Money thinned like light at dusk. The bruise above his rib ached with the rhythm of the news cycle. He kept replaying Sarah's voice in his head. "I had to wake the city." The sentence had been both promise and blade. He wanted to forgive her because he knew why she had done it, but forgiveness was not a currency he could spend freely. He had to live, and the life she had rearranged now bore new risks. Rebecca called late one night. Her voice was low, as if she were speaking into a sleeve to hide a tremor. "They're talking about an internal investigation," she said. "Thomas knows. He's quiet. That makes him dangerous." The words made Michael's skin tighten. Thomas quiet was a storm. "Has he said anything to you?" Michael asked. "No," Rebecca said, "but he's moving pieces. I've heard whispers, requests to pull the footage, to speak to the detective. They're trying to control the narrative." There was a pause. "You need to be careful who you meet. There are people who would like this to go away." The warning felt like a rope thrown across a dark river. Michael tried to accept it without showing fear. He knew what it meant to be removed quietly. He thought of a note slid under his door. "Beware the ones who save faces for favor." He took the warning to mean more now than it had before. Sarah's position was unraveling and tightening at once. She moved like someone who had cut a rope and was trying to catch both ends. Her days were full of meetings and legal motions. She brought subpoenas, affidavits, and a stubborn hope that the law could be a blade when wielded with care. But the more she pushed, the more friends in high places turned away or offered cool support. "Politics," she said once, desperate. "They are calling it a mess we don't want to touch." Michael watched her from the courthouse steps one afternoon. She looked smaller than he had expected, shoulders bent under the weight of strategy. He wanted to tell her to stop, to step back and breathe, but he also felt the echo of the family from her past, the image she had shown him in the audio, a child's face flattened by a case that had been rushed. He wanted to tell her that using him had been wrong, but he also understood the hunger that drove her to drastic choices. Then the threats began. At first, it was a phone call that breathed silence down the line. Then, a brick through the window of a neighbor's store with a note wrapped around it. "Stay out." Michael found the note inside, trembling with someone else's anger. He kept it in his pocket like a talisman and a promise that the conflict had become more than words. Inside Michael, conflict grew a quieter, darker shape. He woke at night, imagining Thomas's hands moving like clockwork. He imagined Rebecca caught between duty and conscience, and Sarah holding files like knives. The more he thought about Thomas's possible motives, preserving a legacy, protecting friends, hiding favors, the worse it became. Power had a smell he recognized now. The smell of warmed metal and stale coffee, of offices where decisions were made to keep a machine running even if the machine hurt people. His sister Grace tried to pull him to safer shores. "Lay low," she told him. "Let Sarah handle it." Her voice was the same one that had comforted him after childhood falls. Michael wanted to obey. He also knew that letting things slide would let a story be written without him. He felt like a character in a book being described by someone else's hand. The law, too, showed its limits. The inspector assigned to review the footage moved slowly, asking for formal complaints and official statements. Michael felt the slow calendar like a tide sucking away urgency. Sarah rushed forms and shouted, bathed in paperwork. "We need witnesses," she said. "We need corroboration." But witnesses were small and scared, or they had their own reasons to remain quiet. The city's people kept their mouths closed when the stakes smelled of more than gossip. Rebecca's conflict sharpened into action. She started coming by more often, sometimes to deliver simple groceries, sometimes to stand and speak in tiny truths. "I can't fix it alone," she told Michael once, her hand hovering above his like a promise she could not yet make real. "But I won't let him hurt you." The way she said "you made it personal," and Michael felt a strange warmth. The reminder that not everyone who wore a badge was the same. Rebecca's presence was a light with shadows at its edge. She could help, but she could also be compromised by friends. Then the first twist of retaliation arrived. The morning paper published a column suggesting that the footage might be doctored. Experts, unnamed and cleanly quoted, said camera angles could mislead, that items could be edited. The article read like a clean, precise attempt to cool outrage. It suggested doubt where there had been raw feeling. Michael felt the wind go out of him. He translated each sentence into the language of power, control the story, erode the truth. His choices narrowed. He could retreat, let the story cool, and perhaps survive. Or he could push until the law did what it promised. Each choice had a cost. Retreat might save him money and privacy, but would let Thomas keep his place. Push would risk more danger for him and for Sarah, and mean tests that could break the fragile alliances that had formed. At night, alone in his small apartment, Michael saw the bruise on his ribs as a map of his choices. He thought of Sarah's confession and Rebecca's quiet loyalty. He thought of Thomas, who had become more than an antagonist. He was now a whole system to be challenged. Michael tasted the weight of responsibility like metal. He had been chosen once. Now he must choose in turn. The next morning, when he met Rebecca at a diner under the cracked sign of a once bright neon, she slid an envelope across the table. Inside were names, people who had worked with Thomas, dates, notes. "I started asking questions," she said, eyes flat and honest. "Not everyone will talk, but some will if they know it's safe." Her hand brushed his, and the contact felt urgent, as if it might be the small thing that kept a larger machine from grinding them down. He looked at the list, each name a possible witness or a possible lie. He realized that the fight ahead would not be clean. It would take courage, yes, but also patience and strategy. It would demand that people choose sides in ways that could not be undone. He set the paper on the table and folded his hands around his coffee. The steam fogged the glass, and for a moment the world seemed suspended between breaths. He had to decide. The city had chosen him once. He would choose whether to be chosen again. The morning of the hearing arrived like a held breath. Rain had started overnight and left the city washed and bright, the courthouse steps slick with a mirror of gray sky. People clustered in small knots on the plaza, some with cameras, some with hands folded like prayers. Michael walked up those steps with his coat buttoned to his throat, the bruise at his side a dull drumbeat. He had not expected to take part in anything official so soon. He had expected waiting, papers, the slow grind of procedure. He had not expected to be asked at the last minute to sit on the bench. A senior judge had fallen ill. The assignment was supposed to be a formality, a temporary placement given to any available magistrate. Michael, who had years at the courthouse and a quiet reputation for careful reading, was offered the post to hear an internal complaint, a hearing into conduct that had become a storm. He felt the irony like cold water. The man arrested at the pump had become the man asked to hold power that very morning. Someone in the clerk's office shrugged and said, "It's just an administrative hearing." They did not know what would happen when truth met procedure. Inside the hearing room, the air smelled of polished wood and old paper. Rows of people filled the benches, family members, reporters, officers in neat uniforms. Thomas sat at the front with a face that had been practiced in the camera lights. His jaw was a hinge of control. Rebecca was present too, hands folded but eyes bright with strain. Sarah sat behind a stack of files that looked almost like armor again. Her face was pale, the confession of the audio having taken years off her. Grace watched from the public gallery, fingers interlaced so tight the knuckles shone white. She had come, silent and steady. Michael took the bench with a steadiness he had had to learn. In that instant, the room seemed to make a new map with him at the center. He felt absurd and raw and powerful all at once. He cleared his throat and let a voice that had rehearsed in quiet rooms carry across the wood. "Today," he said, "we will hear the complaint against Officer Thomas Reed." The words were simple and final. Cameras leaned forward. The city listened. The first evidence was the gas station footage. The grainy clip that had started, everything played on a flat screen in the room and swallowed the light. People who had seen it before now watched with the lift and drop of those seeing the whole truth for the first time. Michael watched himself on the screen the way a child watches a stranger in a mirror, surprised, small, real. Thomas watched too, his face detained in whole muscles. When the moment of planting appeared, the room exhaled like a thunderstorm releasing. Thomas rose to speak. He answered with the same calm he used on the street, then tried to shape the narrative of a mistake, an awkward motion misread by a camera. He called for technical review, for context, for an assertion that the footage could be misleading. He spoke about protocol, about stress on duty, about the human error that came to men who had long hours and families. His words were measured, practiced. He had fought to hold the frame of humanity around himself. Then Rebecca stood. Her voice at first was small, then steady. She told the room what she had told Michael in the diner, that she had seen slips before, that the system sometimes bent for convenience. She did not excuse Thomas. Instead, she reached into a folder and pulled out Bodycam logs, call records, and a small audio recording. Her hand did not tremble when she pushed the devices forward. The audio was a private line of a conversation. Thomas's voice, casual and crisp, saying things that made the room lean in. References to covering a report, scheduling a narrative, adjustments to evidence. His voice spoke in a way that removed doubt. The ripple that ran through those in uniform was like a change in wind. Some faces hardened. Others looked away. Rebecca kept going. She spoke of favors, of nights when officers made decisions for each other and called it solidarity. She said she had supported Michael in quiet ways because she had not agreed with the favors. Now she has gathered the proof. Her testimony carried the weight of a woman who had lived in the contradictions and chosen, finally, to speak. Sarah's turn came next. The room tightened. This was the moment people had waited for, the moral knot about to be untied. She stood slowly and told the story she had once told Michael in a whisper. She admitted the plan. The drive, the public outrage, the hope that pressure would force oversight. She said names and dates, and she owned the part where she used another person's life as a means. Her voice broke on the line where she asked for forgiveness. She did not ask for mercy. She asked for the truth to be taken as an honest tool to change constructs, not just to ruin a single life. To me, she said, voice steadier now, it was a necessary wrong. The sentence fell into the room like a stone. People's reactions divided. Some nodded with the cold logic of consequence, others stared as if betrayed by a lover. Michael listened without moving. Anger and grief and a surprising coldness ran through him. Sarah had betrayed him, yes, but she had also unmasked a broader rot. He felt something else too, the strange clarity of being the one to decide. The bench gave him a view, like a shore. He could see the breadth of damage and the map of choices. Then a sealed envelope was brought forward by an unknown hand, someone from the clerk's office with eyes that skirted the edges of the room. The envelope contained documents that changed focus again. They were internal memos and email threads, conversations between Thomas and a higher-up whose name had not yet appeared in the case. The memos used phrasing that spoke of risk mitigation, of protecting the unit's reputation. It was a network of protection. Thomas had not been acting entirely alone. The betrayal widened from a man to an institution. Faces in the room shifted. The public defender's whispers turned into a low hum of recognition. Michael felt pressure like a tide. He had to rule not just on a man's action, but on a pattern that all these documents hinted at. His heart thudded carefully against his ribs. He thought of Grace, of Rebecca, of Sarah. He thought of the boy from the raid years ago. He thought of the way power wears a polite face. When he called for closing statements, Thomas stood and tried to frame himself as a man misunderstood, a protector in a dangerous job. He said words about loyalty and duty, about the cost of keeping a city safe. But his shorthand could not hold against the accumulated proof. The footage, Rebecca's files, Sarah's confession, the memos. Michael felt the bench under his palms like a scale. He had been chosen by chance to preside that morning, but chance felt less important than the way truth, once assembled, had the power to reorder things. He spoke with a voice that was both personal and just. He named the transgressions clearly. He ordered the immediate suspension of Thomas pending a full investigation and called for an independent review of the unit. He asked the Inspector General to open a wider probe into how evidence and narratives had been managed. The gavel came down and sound filled the room. It was small, but to Michael it felt thunderous. People around him wept and barked and took notes. Some breathed like sailors sighting land. Thomas's face had the look of a man whose map had been taken and redrawn. Rebecca slumped with the release of one who has carried a secret for too long. Sarah, eyes wet, sat as if she had been hollowed out and refilled. When the hearing adjourned, Michael did not leave the bench instantly. He sat for a moment with the quiet after a storm. The city would have more steps to take, appeals, investigations, political pressure. He had not finished anything in the morning. He had opened doors. Outside, Grace waited with a shawl. She came to his side and did not speak. She simply took his arm. Her touch was small and true. Rebecca and Sarah passed them with quick nods, no words, only the tired acknowledgement of people who had survived the night. Michael walked down the courthouse steps, the rain-slick stone a mirror for the morning's upheaval. He thought of choices, the ones he had made and the ones others had made for him. He had been betrayed by someone he trusted. He had also wielded authority he had not expected to hold. The lines between justice and expedience felt thinner now than they had before. In the end, truth had been assembled by many hands, some clumsy, some brave, some guilty. Michael felt both the bitterness of being used and the strange pride of presiding over a moment that might change things. He understood, with an almost physical clarity, that justice was not a single act but a long argument, one that needed witnesses, courage, and the steady insistence on naming what had been done. The city watched. The hearing was a beginning, not an answer. Michael felt the weight of that the way one feels the press of a hand on the back of a neck before diving into cold water. He breathed, and the air tasted clean and dangerous. The weeks after the hearing moved like slow weather. The Inspector General opened a formal probe. Thomas Reed was placed on extended suspension and then charged with evidence tampering and obstruction when investigators found more than the single clip. Other officers were interviewed. Some were cleared, others faced administrative discipline. The memos that had once been hidden in inboxes became public records. They read like a map of small favors and larger silences. The city cannot unsee them. Sarah surrendered to the professional consequences she had feared. The Bar Association opened an ethics review. She lost cases while the inquiry ran. A judge put limits on her court appearances. She did not fight every sanction with the kind of legal fight she had once loved. Instead, she sat in rooms with families she had helped and with those she had hurt, and she listened. Her public apologies were not showy. They were short and direct. "I used a person's life as a means," she said in one hearing, and the words landed like stones into a quiet pool. She accepted censure and a period of supervised practice. She also began volunteering with a legal clinic that helped victims of wrongful conviction. It was small at first, as if she wanted to rebuild trust with the slow work of steady hands. Michael felt the aftertaste of betrayal and the hush that follows a storm. Friends and strangers still debated Sarah's choice. Some called her brave, others called her reckless. Michael could hold both things at once. He had learned to name his anger and to look at where it had come from. He had been used, that was true, but he had also been the instrument of a change that might protect others. The knowledge did not cancel the bruise under his rib, but it altered the story the bruise would tell. Rebecca stayed in the department. She testified openly before the commission and cooperated with investigators. Her actions cost her friendships inside the unit. She would sometimes stand outside the precinct and watch men leave at shift change, thinking of the cost of being honest. The cost was real. The small promotions she might have had slipped away because speaking out rearranged loyalties, yet people began to call her when they wanted to report misconduct because they believed she would listen. She found a quiet dignity in that small trust, and it steadied her through the nights when she felt alone. Michael returned to work in a world rearranged. The odd jobs came back slowly. The courthouse offered him a place doing review work and public outreach, official steps that felt like both an apology and a new responsibility. He said yes. He spoke at community meetings about transparency and how evidence should be handled. He did not seek glory. He wanted the law to be less of a machine that favored the few and more of a shelter for everyone. His voice had been used once. Now he used it to ask for structures that did not depend on the moral courage of a single Sarah or a single Rebecca. Grace stood by him, small and fierce. She joked, sometimes too loudly, about him becoming a judge who could not buy decent suits. She brought him tea and books and asked the same question in different ways. How do you forgive someone who used you? Michael found he could answer halfway truths. Forgiveness, he learned, was not a single act. It was a slow loosening of bitterness and a choice to build meaning from a wound. He did not forget. He simply decided how much of himself he would let the past shape. There were public reforms too. The police department agreed to a third-party audit of internal practices. New training on evidence handling and ethics arrived in classrooms where officers learned the small mechanics of their work. Cameras were supplemented with better logging and independent storage. These changes would not fix everything. They could not fix the years of quiet harm. But they made a practical difference. They made it harder for a single gesture to change a life without record. At night, Michael often stood at the courthouse hinge, watching the old metal bite into the frame. The hinge was a small obsession. It had once seemed like a promise. Now it felt like a test. He would run a hand along the rust and think of the people who had bent the law for convenience and the ones who had bent their lives toward truth. The bruise on his ribs healed into a scar the color of old toast. It was a small, private map of what had been done and what he had survived. One evening, months later, he met Sarah in a park that had more benches than people. The grass smelled of rain and something like the beginning. They sat apart at first, not quite comfortable in the new terms between them. Sarah carried a small stack of files, pro bono cases, she had taken on since the hearings. She did not reach for his hand. She did not ask for absolution. "I wanted to tell you what I am doing," she said, "not to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I want you to know that I am trying to make sure this doesn't happen again. Michael listened. The sentence was both confession and promise. He thought of the boy from the botched raid and of the families who had needed a defense. He thought of all the ways good intentions can be raw tools. He watched her face for a sign that she had more strategy beneath her skin. There was still strategy. Sarah was a lawyer, but the edges had softened. She had traded some certainty for the labor of rebuilding. I won't ask you to say you forgive me, she said, voice small, but I wanted you to know I am trying. Michael let the silence fill the space between them. The park was quiet, and for a moment everything felt simply human. I see what you are doing, he said, and I see what you did. I don't know if that balances anything, but I know people will be safer if you keep doing this work. They did not make a grand reunion. There was no broad embrace or tidy ending. Instead, there was an exchange of something quieter, a mutual recognition that people can be both flawed and useful. They left the park with different steps, aware that the city had changed and that they had been a part of the change. In the quiet that followed, Michael thought often about choices. He thought about what leadership asks of a person: the steadiness to say no when it is easy to say yes, the humility to accept the consequences of a strategy that used others, the courage to rebuild. He thought about the law as a tool that can be made honest or dishonest by how men and women choose to wield it. The city did not turn out perfect. People still argued in cafes. Men who had been shielded by quiet favors found new ways to hold power. The work of reform became a long list of small battles. But the hearing had shown something important: that when enough people gather evidence, speak, and refuse to hide, mistakes can be named and systems can be nudged. One morning, standing on the same slick steps he had once climbed as an accused man, Michael felt the bruise-turned scar under his shirt like proof. He ran his thumb along it, and the memory of pain folded into the knowledge that he had a choice how to live after being used. He would spend his days asking for checks where there had been favors, for records where there had been whispers, for dignity where there had been a quick story. The city would keep changing. He would keep watching. He had been given a strange kind of power, the power of being seen, and he would use it not to repay debts, but to make the hinge hold. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.